Thank
Good
you, Mr.
afternoon
Adams.
and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Museum President's Day Festival. I'm Kennedy Library forum producer Liz Murphy, and now it's my great honor to introduce our guests for this next segment, Second President John Adams and First Lady Abigail Adams. Thank you so much for joining us today to share your insights. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Most kind.
Well, thank you all for joining us here for a commemoration of President's Day, a day meant to respect the office of the person sitting in the president's seat, as opposed to what happened to my good man most of the time he sat in the office.
Indeed.
Now, one of the themes we've been asked to speak upon today is independence, which, of course, is a very weighted word and factors largely into some of the early aspects of Mr. Adams's political career and how we were involved. Of course, in order to speak about independence, you have to understand dependence beforehand. Now, I know that it's been quite some time since any of you, well, no, by a show of hands, were any of you alive when Massachusetts was still a colony?
Besides us?
Okay, just the
indeed.
one back there. Yes, it's been quite some time, so let me explain, bring you back to how things were when we were young and in the early years of our marriage. Of course, Massachusetts and the other colonies in North America were British territories, part of the Empire of Great Britain, settled originally with the idea of being a commercial outpost. If Britain sends colonists to these territories far, far away, the colonists there can grow trees that will be cut down and become ships. They can grow crops that can be shipped back to England or to other places where colonies are. And also the colonists there, well, they're not going to have all the goods that you might have in England, so they're still going to be purchasing English goods. Fabric, textiles, metal goods, anything to make life happen. And so this element of dependence is set in place as the whole structure of it, that the colonies would be dependent on England for any of their finished goods, and yet we would be giving our raw materials to the mother country. And now this was a decent theory. This is how colonial governments work. However, an entire ocean separating you from the mother country and a long period of time when the mother country doesn't necessarily have the means to be governing you closely means that a colony like Massachusetts or Virginia or New Jersey over time starts to develop its own opinion of what it means to be from North America, what it means to govern yourselves here, to be a Massachusetts citizen, to be a Connecticut citizen, to be a New Hampshire citizen. And so by the time of 1776, when things have come to attention, a war has begun, and some of the colonies are beginning to say we should no longer be a part of this empire system, we should be independent, well, there has to be a union between all of the colonies in order to do so. And Mr. Adams, some of his first steps onto the large-scale political stage were as a delegate to the Congress to discuss whether the colonies should separate and become independent. And now keep in mind, independent means you need to do it on your own. And to be entirely independent is a very, very difficult thing. So in balance, you may in fact want to be interdependent. Massachusetts, if it breaks off on its own, is not going to survive in its own state. We are going to have to depend on our neighbors and create a new identity, an American identity. And Mr. Adams can speak on some of the debates that went into the independence argument and how we came to be with the situation we are now.
Well, I can tell you, good people, if you had asked the delegates to the very first Congress in Philadelphia in 1774, that September and October, how they felt about independence, they would have been in complete shock. The thought of independence was not what we were gathering about. We were gathering about our rights as Englishmen, our rights at free trade, of non-importation with Great Britain, until Parliament decided it was going to treat us more equitably as far as those taxes and as subjects of Great Britain. We came to some agreement, but certainly nothing along the lines of independence. I can remember clearly being greeted by Thomas Mifflin and dear Dr. Rush before we even entered Philadelphia. Myself, my second cousin Samuel Adams, Robert Treat Payne, and Thomas Cushing. They warned us that so many of the other delegates were afraid of us and feared the road we were taking them down. Now look at me. I'm 5'8". Do I frighten anyone in this room? I do not think so. Maybe when I start to talk, I do. But at that Congress, meeting men such as George Washington and Patrick Henry of Virginia, the Rutledges of South Carolina, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and so many others, John Dickinson, who eventually I would oppose in the great debates to come, the thought of independence was not on our minds. There was a letter that was written to His Majesty, King George III, a petition for him to address our grievances, to step in on our behalf for Parliament, and an agreement of non-importation. There was no talk of independence, but times would change. Blood would be spilled, as you know, in the spring of 1775, as a prelude to the Second Congress. Blood was spilled right here in Massachusetts, at Lexington, at Concord, and a month into our return in Philadelphia, at the Battle of Breed's Hill. Blood was spilled then. We lost our dear friend, Madam Dr. Warren, on that terrible day, which you would have observed the battle from Penn's Hill. I received constant letters from Mrs. Adams and replied in kind about our situation. Well, much of it was in secret, so as best that I could. And I returned to that Congress, and what did I hear from my fellow delegates, particularly from the middle and southern colonies? More of the same. More petitions to His Majesty. John Dickinson penning the olive branch petition, begging His Majesty to speak for our behalf in Parliament, and others who were in agreement with us in those two bodies. And it is doubtful His Majesty even read it. Believe it or not, let me ask you again, do you people like me? Show of hands. I see no hands, Mrs. Adams.
A handful, that's good.
I would become disliked. Imagine that, and considered obnoxious by some. Perhaps it is because I wrote a letter regarding Mr. Dickinson when we had an exchange. When he was talking peace, I observed that powder and artillery would be the most efficacious ways for us to continue this struggle. And he did not like that one bit, and we had an exchange of words, and I wrote something I should not have about him, calling him a piddling genius. And it ended up, believe it or not, in the newspapers, and we did not even touch hats. I was an outcast for a time, but I knew I was right. How did I go from being an outcast to be at the forefront of independence, you must wonder? Well, I had a friend who would help with that, and his name is Thomas Paine. He wrote Common Sense. Our argument had always been with Parliament. But now, in Common Sense, Thomas Paine wrote that the idea of a monarch as the leader of a people was ridiculous. And he tore down the British government. It got me to write, because though his points were good, not regarding government, but as far as a monarchy, I felt I must respond. And I wrote thoughts on government. But because of Thomas Paine, the seed of independence was planted that winter. People were starting to think about it. People were starting to talk about it. You were talking to your neighbors about it and your family. And suddenly, the Congress was behind the people, if you can imagine that. We were behind them in our thoughts on independence, and I knew that the time had to come. But we had to create an agreement. It is much like when you're all walking somewhere together. What inevitably happens? You have some of you who are the fastest and some of you who are the slowest. So what do the fastest people have to do? They have to wait for the slowest, which is essentially what we did going into the spring of 1776. We started to create a government, however, through that Congress, with a government regarding foreign policy, with the creation of a navy. All of these things were happening until finally, in June, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood and put forth a motion in Congress that these united colonies of right ought to be free and independent states. That is not a government of all of the now states together. That is independence for all, which I had thought about. And what do these independent states need? They need constitutions. How do we win the war, ladies and gentlemen? Will we be able to do it alone with our meager provisions? We will need an ally. But most importantly, we needed independency. Those who were opposed to independence, at least at that time, of the middle and southern colonies, postponed the vote for independence to July 1st. They thought it was far too soon. They thought that we needed to form a more proper government. They thought we needed allies, such as the French, and they had to consult with the people at home. Well, some delegates did not have to do that. They had the power to vote for their state, and some did not, as New York would have to wait. But time was starting to march forward, ladies and gentlemen. And while we waited for that momentous day of July 1st, we formed a committee to write a declaration of that independence. There is one member of that committee that is sitting in this room. Do you know who he is? That would be me. And Dr. Benjamin Franklin, and young Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who would write it. And maybe I will think differently as an older man, but in those days it was not because I felt he was a superior writer or that I was obnoxious, although I will probably think so when I'm an old man, but because a Virginian had to lead. And Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston, who was against it. And slowly but surely, that document came together. And then, on July 1st, the gavel was sounded and the last time for debate over independence came. John Dickinson, one of the moderates, the one I insulted, tall and lean, like me, gave his last case for the fact that it was too soon. We had not won a major battle. We were so different, each state, as far as money, as far as rights between each, and just being different people with different economies. We hadn't won a major battle. It was too soon. And he closed by saying that declaring independence now would be like braving the storm in a skiff made of paper. I had to stand and respond, as you can imagine. And my response was that I wish I had the oratory skills of the great philosophers of the classical times, because no issue was more important than this one. We had the privilege of starting a country, the opportunity, a new country, a republic, providing for the people, giving them rights that had not been seen or heard of before. We owed it to those who came before us, and we owed it to those to come, to declare our independence. And also, it would give General Washington's men a reason to fight. It took time. We had a majority that day, but it was not unanimous. July 2nd. There were holdout states, if you can imagine. There was, of course, Pennsylvania, which had Robert Morris and John Dickinson, who were against it, and they had a majority at the time. Little Delaware had 3 delegates. 1 for, 1 against, and Caesar Rodney was not present. He would eventually arrive to change the balance. South Carolina was against it. But after I gave my speech on the floor the day before for 2 hours, anyone up for 2 hours of John Adams? Well, it was 1 hour. And then the gentleman from New Jersey changed from against to for independence and wanted to hear it again. So I gave it at the hint of Edward Rutledge. He changed South Carolina's vote. John Dickinson and Robert Morris were vacant on July 2nd. They were not present, so that Pennsylvania voted for independence. Every state voted for independence that July 2nd, except for New York, of course. Well, they would vote for it. They had to wait for their assembly at home to vote for it. And that was when I wrote to Mrs. Adams that July 2nd would be the great day, the epocha in our history, that there would be shows and games and fireworks and musket demonstrations. July 2nd would be that great day.
So very close.
Was that 2 hours, Mrs. Adams? No?
Not quite 2 hours that time around. It was nice and concise on that part. Now, of course, Mr. Adams speaks of the Continental Congress and these grand ideas of independence for the nation as a whole, and the interdependence of the new states, and how every one of the states had to bring themselves to the same point before independence was declared. Because if not, it would be some states becoming outright enemies to the crown and our neighbors being the closest outpost of the crown. Because we had to make sure we were a united front to prove to other nations that we were worthy of investing in, that they could send soldiers or ships to help us with this war. And of course, declaring independence is just words. You must follow through on it. And you have to learn how to govern yourself. If you are turning against the government, which has organized your society, your culture, your laws for all of this time, you do have to figure out some structure. In the meantime, Mr. Adams also mentioned the Common Sense by Thomas Paine, the pamphlet that really so many people in North America began to read in 1776. These ideas of independence for the nation, but also ideas of the natural rights of mankind. Mr. Paine did something where he distilled the thoughts of the Enlightenment philosophers, these men, Locke and Thoreau, and every great minds who were thinking that perhaps every human who comes to this planet, every life begins at an equal stage, and that perhaps the governments of man, the inequalities, are ways that we have strayed from that human nature. Not only can we think of this in terms of governments, but of individuals. How can I, as an individual, be an independent person? And it gets trickier, of course, because how can I, a woman in 1776, who has no right to property in her own name, no vote within my community, how can I be an independent person? In fact, the structure of society, the structure of our government limits me and my ability to interact that way, and yet, because of this extraordinary circumstance of times, because there was a war going on where my partner, my husband, was states away from me. It would take weeks to get a letter to him, for him to write a response and have it returned to me. And so I had to make decisions. I had to decide what to do with our house, with the properties we were renting, with what kinds of crops we ought to grow in our farm, with how we would harvest those crops when all of our farm hands were going off to join the army and the militia, how to sustain the family, how to keep us alive in light of the endless diseases and illnesses that would come and force themselves upon us and damage our society. So, independent thought was really quite a struggle for myself and for a number of women who had to step into this role, some of us for the very first time. But having that small taste of independence, of saying, even if the property of my house and of the farm is not in my name, I am acting as a delegate of Mr. Adams, somebody chosen by him, a representative of his ideas and his things that he would want to keep in place, then I have to think to myself, what is the greatest good, not just for me, but for Mr. Adams, for the entire family? What is the good for the people who work on the farm? What is the good for our children, for our brothers and sisters, for the members of our church community, for the people in the town next door, the state next door, for the people who would come 50 years from now? These ideas of independence, of making the rules for yourself that make sense, and finding a way to adhere to them, and hold true to them, to truly self-identify. This notion of independence factored down into individual people in such a strong and new way that by the time the war progressed and eventually was over, I was beginning to think of these properties, of the house, of the money, our investments, stocks and bonds, as things that I was in charge of. This was my money. This was my farm. This was my stocks and bonds that I purchased. Now, these ideas of independence, of course, like I said, carried through down to the very basics of society, but you do also have to consider that while each of us is beginning to have this idea of I am my own self and can define what I am, who I am, what is an important value to me, and how I ought to govern myself on an individual scale and a larger government scale, well, you can't have every individual creating their own government. That's not society anymore. Because if entire power is invested in one individual, we all know the downfalls of mankind, of how great power, when vested in the small or the few, whether in the many or few, is ever grasping. It, like the grave, will consume, cry, give, and great fish will swallow up the small. And those who were most eager for the prerogatives of the people when campaigning and saying that they would serve those who elected them into office, so frequently, as soon as they are given power, they turn to themselves. The power is for self. So how can we create a system of government that keeps us in check, that keeps an individual from seizing too much power? And all of these, of course, came through in discussions of how to create the new government.
I have a few ideas on that. Now, let us think back to that day of July 2nd, which actually was July 4th, when it was signed by President Hancock. And when debates had been finished regarding some of the passages in it. Did this Declaration of Independence provide for everybody? Is there any language about women in the Declaration of Independence?
There is not.
As she reminded me beforehand that spring, to remember the ladies, we had to remove a passage condemning the slave trade and blaming His Majesty for it. Now, you may look at it as the point that it needed to be done then. And you are right, but it could not be done then. Number one, to blame His Majesty for the slave trade for a practice that we have been maintaining since early settlement is ridiculous. But number two, how is independence gained if half the delegates in Congress walk out of the room? The plain fact is we saw it. No matter how much we would have wished for independence to have been for everyone, it could not be. We could not win a war without those in the southern colonies. Without them and the bounty of their plantations, we would have been lost. Most regrettable indeed, and something that we will have to deal with in the future long after our lifetimes. But what is the most important thing forgotten of all? The timing of this declaration was in 1776. The final peace treaty would not be signed until 1783, and my making 2 journeys to Europe to accomplish that, as well as loans from the Dutch. What is this country going to look like if we are fortunate enough to win our independence? How will we form a government? During the war, we formed a loose confederation through the Articles of Confederation. Would that stand the test of time? Or would a stronger government be necessary? How will other states feel about a federal constitution?
Well, certainly, and as both of us came to see through the years of the constitutional era, the passing, the ratification of the Constitution, the adding of the Bill of Rights to protect the rights of individuals who feared that the Constitution in its form itself would not do the adequate protection, would not keep one chief executive from having all of the power, that there would be a balance with legislators, with courts, with a whole system that could keep people in track, that could keep the government running, so that everybody in service to the government, every employee would be in fact serving, giving to their government, giving to their people, not taking for themselves the whole time. Of course, it's complicated. How do you find that equilibrium? And these questions would go back and forth.
Indeed.
Of course,
Currency.
Mr. Adams and I would write letters to each other, always discussing theoreticals. If power is granted to so-and-so, what would then happen? Oh, well, if we have New Jersey set in place this new voting element where people of any gender who have property might be able to vote. Will the voting habits of the state of New Jersey carry through and become the law of the land? These things, it's an active discussion that continues onward, but all the meanwhile, it becomes clearer and clearer that there needs to be the interdependence in order to have that independence, to just decide for self what is right. Everybody begins butting heads before too long. We live in a society, and rules and laws and governance are necessary for the happiness of the people, for us to serve each other by giving up small elements of our freedoms, and by putting in place a system that can then enable us, each of us, to be equally free with each other. This was a common theme that kept coming through.
So many questions, Mrs. Adams.
Certainly.
From the government structure to a currency to perhaps westward expansion to foreign policy. Who will have the strength, the new federal government if there is one, or just a confederacy with the strength being in the states? I marvel at the struggle during the war, but I marvel at the struggle after it with a new nation, the continuance of that nation. And do you know who has the answer? All of you do. You are the answer. You have that answer as to what this country will be. And it makes me think of this as we end our talk with you, that when I wrote, and it was eventually ratified, the Constitution of Massachusetts, I wrote with immense pride of my Constitution that it is a good government if the people have the good sense to keep it. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Adams and I thank you very much for listening to what we have to say this day. Mrs. Adams.
President Adams, Madam First Lady, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you back on this stage in just about 5 minutes for another presidential town hall. Thanks to all of you for joining, and we hope to see you at many of the other activities today as well. Have a great day.
Who does not like a good town meeting? Matt.